Hello, I'm Jimmy Dickinson from Longley Farm. I've been asked by the Climate Emergency Committee to put together a few images to help explain the farming activity that's going on at Longley and to set that in the context of the climate emergency. The title of this talk is A Local Farm Making a Difference. What you're looking at here in this first image is a group of native red poll cattle grazing on permanent pasture in the fields around Longley. And up on the hill is a wind power generator putting renewable green energy into the dairy. For those that don't know, the first commercial wind power generator in England was put up at Longley Farm in the early 1980s, and then it was replaced about 5 years ago by the one that you can see here, and that was done in a joint enterprise with HOT, that's Home Firth Transition Town. Where is Longley? Well, it's about 1.5 miles south of Home Firth, up Dunford Road on the B6106. It's certainly an early medieval site because we know this from the records at the Manor of Wakefield. And Lee means field, so Longley is long field, and it was an area of flat land that could be ploughed by oxen. So we know it's been in continuous agricultural use for at least 700 years. The land that we're farming at Longley is that within the yellow boundary that you can see on this image. My father and uncle inherited Upper Longley Farm, which was about 30 acres in 1948. In the 1950s, they bought Lower Longley Farm. And then over the years since, we've bought pieces of land in various little pockets here and there. The original Longley is that area that you can see around the dairy. And if you look at the walls in there, I think that can probably give an idea of how the medieval ploughmen were working. And I think they were going top to bottom, which is east-west, rather than left to right, which is north-south. That's just speculation on my part, but it's. I think I could imagine how they were doing it. If you look at some of the very old pictures of Longley Farm going back, there wasn't a tree on the place. And I know certainly that my father was told that trees wouldn't grow there because it was above the tree line. But in the late 1960s, he did have a go at planting some trees. And the main reason behind that was as snow breaks. Because in those days, we used to get some very, very severe weather, and the roads used to fill up with snow and become impassable. Now, amazingly, the trees did grow, although not very well. And I think it's very clear now what was going on. Longley Farm was not above the tree line. Longley Farm was in the smoke belt. And the smoke belt was an expression to describe land that was within the fallout area for industrial pollution that was coming from the textile zone in the industrial West Riding or from industrial Lancashire. And the amount of soot that fell per year per acre was measured in hundredweights, and the area was absolutely black. And the reason that the trees weren't growing wasn't anything to do with tree lines, it was to do with pollution. I can remember as a boy my surprise when I discovered that sheep weren't black. All the sheep I'd ever seen before going on holiday up to the Dales were local sheep, and they were black with soot and industrial pollution. So the first trees were put in as snow breaks, and then over time they've been put around the place partly for snow still, partly for habitats for animals, and partly just to make the place look a lot nicer, especially when seen from a distance. You can see in this slide, in the areas that are marked with green, that those are the areas where we've actually put in trees as what I'm describing as being shelter belts. Once I'd realised that we weren't above the tree line and that trees would grow, then I started to get more ambitious. In some areas, I replaced some of the very worst walls with hedges, and in other areas, I put in brand new hedges. None of them are old enough yet to have been laid, so you're looking at these growing quite tall here on Choppers Bank Lane. I think the main things that I had in mind were biodiversity, encouraging animals, wildlife, birds. I made sure that they were mixed hedges and there was plenty of winter food for birds in there. You can see from the areas marked blue where all the new hedges have been planted. Now, I've been planting hedges for about 15 years, and some of them are very well grown now, and some of them are still only 12 months old. So it's very much a work in progress, but it has been incredibly successful. Inside the ring fence, there aren't any hedges, they're all dry stone walls. Now, dry stone walling is something that I've been interested in for a lot of years, and I think for my 12th birthday I got a walling hammer as a present. So it's something I've been doing for a long time. And this is a wall that, along with Michael Saxon, that I'm working on. Soaks up a lot of stone, but with a bit of luck, it'll be there to last. The walls at Longley, you can date them by the different kinds of construction and the different kinds of stones that are being used. There are some which look extremely ancient to me, and I could well imagine the original medieval people pulling stone out of the ground to build them. Some of them are much more recent and it's quarried stone, and you can see it that's actually being brought there rather than stone that's being picked up out of the fields. In one way, I do feel pleased that I'm renewing these walls, but in another way, when you're replacing what's been there for hundreds of years, you do wonder a little bit about what you're doing, but to actually attempt to restore an old wall is incredibly difficult. It's surprising what comes out of these walls. One of the main things that you find is old bottles, and I've got sort of an idea that some of these old wallers who were building these things, I can imagine them with a little bottle of gin or something like that, just to have a little nip just to keep them warm as they were doing it. What's the point of putting a wall up? Well, if you're grazing animals, you've got to have them in controlled areas. So the walls create grazing zones, and you can move the animals from one zone to another. Once the wall's up, it really also acts as an animal corridor, wildlife corridor. The hedges are wildlife corridors pretty obviously because the animals are in there scurrying about. But surprisingly, the walls carry out a similar function. Animals don't like to just run across open fields. They like to have a little bit of cover. It's also interesting that creatures such as bats, they will follow lines such as a wall. So if you want to encourage bats to go from one area to another, they will follow the line of the wall. Shelter is incredibly important. The big weather, the bad weather here can blowing down from home moss, and on really horizontal, driving, wet rain days, you'll see animals getting down behind these walls to actually get a bit of shelter from what's going on around them. So, very, very important in the rural landscape. You can see here the walls that have been totally rebuilt, marked up in orange. They're all the ones that run along the boundaries of where I imagine those medieval farmers ploughing their fields. These pictures were taken on Choppers Banks, and that's a place that's always been very special to me, and I've always realised that there was something a little bit different about it. I think the modern term for it is grazed heathland, and the point about it is this, that its whole landscape relies on the presence of animals. If animals weren't on there occasionally doing some grazing, then it would turn into probably overgrown with gorse. The point about the animals is that they promote a certain kind of plant growth and therefore a certain kind of wildlife that goes with it. For example, ground nesting birds. The picture on the right shows an area that hasn't been touched for a good 50 years, and what you can see there is bracken and self-seeded trees such as oak. And the picture on the left, there's a lot more grass in there, but they're all species naturally generated, such as Yorkshire fog. We've also planted in there some occasional trees, so it's a heathland with a little bit of shade in it. I've been doing this for a lot of years, and I didn't know that what I was doing was rewilding, but since reading the book and listening to it on the radio, I can now tell you that I've been active in rewilding for a considerable number of years. The areas marked in bronze show where rewilding is currently going on. The bottom left is the area that I showed you with all the bracken on it. Bottom right, that's the grazed heathland, which I'm actually actively managing to be grazed heathland. And then the top piece is an area that hasn't been farmed for many years, probably 30, and there's some natural regeneration going on there. That's on an area that's called Longley Edge, and the bottom areas are called Choppers Banks. Now I am wondering whether to extend that area of rewilding on Longley Edge, and that's maybe a little project for the future. We almost take water for granted, but it's an incredibly important resource and has to be looked after. I put a lot of effort into trying to get all the good quality water off the area of Longley Farm. That's either through land drains or surface water, to get it down proper culverts and to get it into the river rather than sending it down the sewer. We've struggled in recent years with climate change and flooding, and I've put a lot of work into attenuation and flood control, and I think it's finally paid off. That's taken me about 20 years one way or another. It's been a very, very big job, but the days of Dunford Road being flooded, well, fingers crossed, are gone, and the days of local houses being flooded again, fingers crossed, are gone. But one of the features of climate change is a much greater increase in torrential rainfall, and a lot more provision has had to be put into place to deal with it. The blue lines show the culvert and water attenuation system, which is a fancy word for a dam. It runs water down to the river as opposed to putting it into the sewer. This culvert system, I think, is at least 300 years old. There are areas where I've actually reinstated it. There are other areas where it's actually collapsed and I've had to actually rebuild it or reroute it. Something which I've been very keen on, and very keen on pioneering really, is taking dairy waste or dairy effluent and making the best use of it that I possibly can on the land. By dairy effluent, what I mean is that if, for example, you've made a tank of yoghurt and washed it out, well, there's going to be some yoghurt residue in the wash water. Typically, that would go down the sewer to a sewage treatment plant. But that residue does contain some residual protein, which is a source of slow-release nitrogen for the land, and residues of lactose, which is a carbohydrate which will nourish some of the microflora within the land. So by careful use of irrigation and these little irrigators, we can encourage grass growth, recycle waste. There's been no chemical fertiliser used at Longley for at least 30 years, maybe 40. It's permanent pasture. There's no ploughing going on. Now, ploughing is a very tricky subject in itself, because ploughing is a natural way of weed control as opposed to using a chemical such as Roundup. But also when you plough, you do release carbon into the atmosphere, so it is a tricky area. But if you've got permanent pasture, well, you're avoiding the use of chemicals and you're avoiding ploughing. Fertility transfer, well, what that's about is that you may only irrigate a part of the field, but having grazing animals on the field will actually transfer that fertility to all the four corners of it. We've had excellent results out of irrigation with soil organic matter and high worm counts. So what's actually going on here is it's converting a waste which would then have to go on to subsequent treatment into a resource which is actually doing the land a lot of good, and whilst it's at it, is capturing carbon. This image shows the underground network that has been put in for the irrigation system. Some of it goes back to the 1960s, and some of it was put in about 10 years ago. But on the original Longley, you can see how the whole lot can be irrigated one way or another. So far I've talked about things such as the creation of enclosures with hedges and walls, creation of shelter with shelter belts, looking after the water and drainage, grazing heathland and rewilding, and irrigation to put nutrients into the soil. And what's the result of all that? Well, the result is an awful lot of high quality grass. And what do you do with grass? Well, the answer is you have to let the grass be grazed by a ruminant. and the two ruminants that we can look at are cattle, and we can look at sheep. So far my focus has been on the red polls, although this year we have done a little bit of work with some sheep as well. Now if you look at this picture here, what you see is some red polls in some very, very long grass. Now a lot of people would say, well, that's ridiculous, that grass is far too long for them to be attempting to graze. But this was an experiment this year, and this is called mob grazing. And the idea here is that the cows, they eat a proportion, and they waste a proportion, and they tread a proportion into the soil, and it's roughly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And the point about treading the grass into the soil is to actually get more organic matter in there. The part that they waste, well, potentially that's going to be for sheep later on in the year. And then the part that they eat, if you look to the far right, well, what you can see there is how grass is converted to organic matter. That's cow muck, which passes into the soil, increases organic matter, increases fertility. So in an extensive system like this, grazing by ruminants is an absolute vital part of the process of capturing carbon. We don't make hay every year, but weather permitting, I think it's quite an interesting thing to do. What's the reasons behind hay making? Well, one reason could easily be that if you've got more grass than animals, it's a good way of doing something with it. But from a technical point of view, if you find that you've put more nutrients onto the land than maybe the land needs for the grass production, then what you do is you take a crop off, and that actually depletes a lot of the nutrients. You take that crop off and you transport it elsewhere for feeding to animals. It's also actually the result of carbon capture. So what's actually being loaded onto the back of this trailer is captured carbon. Now it's not going to just be buried, it's going to be fed to animals. But again, once it's being fed to an animal, it will, through that ruminant, it will go through its digestive system, turn into cow muck, and end up back on the land. Extensive agriculture, carbon capture. Last year we worked with Dutchy College to do some analysis of the land at Longley, and I've picked out 3 fields here to compare with their trial average results. Now in their trials they had all kinds of land. They had permanent pasture right through to arable. But in terms of tons of carbon per hectare, their trial average was 141 tonnes per hectare, and the number of worms was 121 worms per cubic metre. How do you count worms? Well, you dig holes of a known size, and you count the worms, and those are the figures. Now, if you look at the results for Longley, the first thing you notice is that in terms of carbon and worms, we are significantly above the trial average. The lowest figure for carbon is the grazed grassland. Now, the grazed grassland, that's an area that hasn't had any irrigation, but it has been grazed by ruminants. And what you're seeing there is 183 tonnes of carbon per hectare. If you go right to the top and you look at a very, very similar piece of land, but this time it has had the benefit of the irrigation with the dairy residues, you're looking at 268 tonnes of carbon per hectare, which is not far away from twice that trial average. Similarly, if you look at worms, the grazed grassland at 180 is more than the trial average, and the irrigated area has got even more worms. For me, one of the really fascinating things is the amount of carbon that's being captured in that grazed heathland. And that grazed heathland, it's not just grass. You're looking at things like heather, ling, bilberries, blackberries, gorse. There's all kinds of things going on in there. And as that biomass rots down and is absorbed into the soil, then it's actually absorbing a tremendous quantity of carbon. And that process would not be going on without the grazing by the ruminants, the cattle or the sheep. If there was no grazing, what would actually happen is scrub forest would take over and the amount of carbon capture would be significantly less. If you've managed to stay with it to this point, then what you'll have noticed is I've been talking about recycling waste. That's the dairy wash waters. I've been talking about making the absolute best use of rainwater or any rainwater that you don't need, how to actually get it into the river without causing tremendous flood damage. I've looked at how can you come up with extensive systems which actually absorb carbon into the soil, and on a net basis, even though that you're working with ruminants, that you've actually absorbed more carbon than you've actually produced. Looked at soil improvement, that's tons of carbon retained in the soil, and we looked at worms as a great measure of the life of the soil. Biodiversity, that's all about not being involved in monoculture, having the hedges and the shelter belts and the wildlife that comes with it and the plant life that comes with it. And what we mustn't also forget is that after we've done all of these things, we have ended up with some food. And to conclude, what I actually find really amazing is that all these things that I've been talking about and all the things that we've been doing for years and I've been doing for years has actually got a name now, and it's called regenerative farming. And I'm proud to actually discover and to announce that I, Robert James Dickinson, am a regenerative farmer at Longley Farm.
Hi, I'm Chris Harrap, the estate manager for J&E Dickinson, and as well as Jim Dickinson talking about what we're doing at the moment at Longley in terms of climate and environment. I'm going to talk you through our farm at Barnsley, 18 miles away from Longley Farm itself, and I'll talk you through what we're doing already, what we'd like to do better, and what we're learning. So the farm itself is on the eastern edge of Barnsley between Ardsley and Darfield, and it sits next to the main Barnsley to Doncaster Road, and the River Dearne is our northern boundary. And our fields there are a mix of grassland and arable crops, and there's 2 farmsteads and plenty of woodland, particularly on the northern part of the farm. Tyers Hall is a mixed farm based on circular principles where we farm arable, grassland, dairy cows, pigs and beef cattle, and the cows graze out of pasture for as much of the year as possible, and then we bring them inside in the winter bedded on straw, and we keep also pigs in straw bedded barns as a waste digester for the byproducts from Longley Farm. The pigs also give us natural fertiliser, obviously, in the form of their manure and slurry, and that goes on the land. Both the cows and the pigs produce that farmyard manure and slurry, which is spread on the fields to provide natural fertility and nutrients so that we don't have to use much synthetic fertiliser. We're constantly trying to reduce chemical inputs, and ultimately we're striving to get to a point where we don't need any at all, and we're always aiming to harness natural cycles as much as we can. On the farm, we also have some other small enterprises like apple juice from our orchards, which we do every year, and seasoned firewood. And we're now looking at other diversification opportunities, such as a farm shop and the wedding and events bar. So, as well as everything that's happening with the climate and the environment, the economics of farming are changing. And as we leave the EU, farm subsidies are going to be disappearing over the next 7 years. So instead of being paid for owning land and farming it, which is what happened as part of the EU, regardless of farming practices, our government is only going to pay farmers anything if they use their land to provide environmental services, or what they call public goods. So things like flood management, increasing biodiversity, and carbon sequestration to mitigate climate change. And a lot of things are coming together here. We also believe we'll soon be asked to pay for carbon footprint on our farms. A lot of businesses are already doing that already. And we're pleased that the economics are converging with how we want to farm anyway. And we are continuously trying to improve. And hopefully the economics are pushing farmers to be even more natural, more climate friendly, and to encourage biodiversity. So where are we at now? Well, at both Tyers, Hall and Longley, we've always been committed to nature and conservation, but we're stepping it up and setting some goals to kind of accelerate that. So we've done 3 things this year. We've done a habitat survey where we measured that 10% of our land is unfarmed area, and that includes things like woodland, hedges, field margins, conservation strips like nectar mix and bird mix. And we've assessed that, and it comes to 10% of our overall land area. Secondly, we've done an ecological survey, which has just been completed last week, to understand the nature and the wildlife on the farm. What species have we got? How many of them? Best guess, and how might we improve that to understand the overall ecology of the farm. And thirdly, we've taken biological soil samples across the land to understand where our soils are in terms of soil health, soil organic matter content, bulk density, aggregation, and what its overall condition is, so that we know where we've come from and where we're going. And all this is taken so that we've got a baseline from which we can measure our improvements. So we've decided to take 3 steps. The first thing is we've decided to double the area of unfarmed land from 10% to 20%. 20% is cropping up in a lot of government policy, probably by coincidence, but we discussed it and we said we think 20% is a good figure to aim for, double the land area. And it won't just be woodland and hedges that we'll be planting. We're thinking, there are other things that are really great carbon sinks and really great habitats, so like wetlands, potential for some intermittent flood pasture down near the River Dern on our land. So it isn't just trees and hedges, it's what is the best habitat, what is the best thing we can provide ecologically. And we're going to do a full carbon footprint assessment to look at all our farming activities and to identify necessary improvements and opportunities. So we know that, for example, a tonne of bagged nitrogen fertiliser has a carbon footprint of 3.47 tonnes, which is pretty bad. And we're always wanting to reduce that anyway. But how can we use our farm vehicles less? How can we sequester more carbon on our farm's land? And some of that will be into soils, some will be into wetlands, etc. And we're going to dramatically change the way that we manage our soils. And this is a massive learning curve for all farmers that we're all going through at the minute. It's a big learning curve of we've kind of, as we've been driven towards production and productivity, quite understandably, since the Second World War and wanting to be self-sufficient and productive on our farmland, there have been some unintended consequences with that. And so we need to make sure that we're looking after our soils and improving their health. So just in terms of increasing that unfarmed area, we love hedges. we've planted many miles of hedges since and laid and managed them well, I'd say, since Joseph Dickinson first bought the farm in the 1970s. And in a recent laying cycle, we've laid over 2 miles in the last 5 years, and over a kilometre of laying planned every year. I say we've laid; it's been laid by our hedge layer Jasper Pracek, who's an amazing guy, and he turns these rows of trees into living fences, and they're not just rows of trees. They are living fences. They keep animals in, and they keep trespassers out. They keep people where we need them to be kept in terms of walking through crops and such. They're natural shelter for our animals. They're great wildlife habitat, good sources of food, carbon sinks, and a timber resource. And basically, our hedge plan aims to make our fields more secure so we can graze more of the farm, and to try and get away from the need for posts and wire fencing. So this year we're planting 430 metres of hedge planting. There'll probably be more than that next year, but that's hedges. Woodland. This year we're planting lots of trees in little field corners, and that'll be funded by a woodland, or part funded by Woodland Trust grant. And this is a good thing anyway, because as farm machinery's got larger, lots of the field corners are difficult to farm anyway. So tree planting makes those corners kind of curved and more convenient for machinery, for the farm staff too. Next year we're planting some larger scale shelter belts and planting up some poorer areas of fields where we may as well take those unproductive areas out of farmed area and concentrate on giving some of it back to nature and providing some really good shelter and product for the future. But to get to 20% for unfarmed area as our target, we'll need to plant a lot more trees and create other habitats, as I've spoken about. So perhaps that will be wetlands, perhaps rewilding in the truest possible sense. We're doing some ecological assessments at the moment. Not everything is about simply leaving more space for nature and planting trees, hedges, and other plants like that. We also need to manage our soils differently. And there's a big change happening at the moment in farming, which I mentioned earlier, and more people are shifting their mindset to a much more biological approach to soils, and really thinking how better to care for what is ultimately an absolutely magical living ecosystem. They say that in a handful of soil, there are more organisms than there ever have been humans on Earth. And soil is a really special thing to learn about. And when you start seeing it like that, you think to yourself, okay, how do we look after this? So there's some really great principles of something called regenerative agriculture, which are outlined here, which I won't go through. You can read them yourself. But soil has a huge potential as a carbon sink if we manage it in the right way. And there's a growing movement which is called regenerative agriculture. And as I say, those principles are laid out there. But essentially, it's all about not disturbing soil if we can help it, and getting diversity in there and feeding the soil, whether it's with livestock activity and natural manures or other similar activities. A big part of regenerative farming is managing grazing in a different way. And we're really big believers in using grazing herbivores as a tool to manage grasslands. And even if you don't agree with the ethics of eating meat, which we totally respect, that's a personal choice, we believe that roaming animals managed in the right way have a really great role to play in maximising soil carbon sequestration. And just as a figure there, if you plant a hectare of broadleaf woodland, it can sequester in a year about 4.7 tonnes of CO2. If you increase soil organic matter by 0.1% in a field on a hectare of land, that will have sequestered 8.9 tonnes. So these are complex things to think about. It's not as simple as just trees. How do we sequester more carbon as quickly as we can to try and mitigate climate change, and what role do animals have to help us build that soil organic matter? how should we manage grazing? That is a complex question. And what we're learning is that managing grazing to focus on soil health and build soil organic matter, which is essentially soil carbon, it does require a different mindset, and it requires some thought and planning. So it's not as simple as moving animals onto fields when the grass is long and then moving them onto the next field when they've eaten it off. It's all about mimicking how nature manages grasslands. And throughout history, the large grasslands, such as the Great Plains and the prairies of the Midwest in America, or the savannas and the Serengeti, they've been grazed by large herds of roaming herbivores. They arrive in a place tightly bunched to protect themselves from predators. They graze it intensively, they're fertilizing it as they do, and they're trampling a lot of the grass as they move around. And then they move on as the herd, and they don't return to that place for a long time. And it's that combination of intensive grazing activity for a short period of time, followed by a long rest period, that builds soil organic matter. And so we need to mimic that in our farming activities. And you can see an example of it in practice here on this picture. If we overgraze grasses, such as in the top left, instead of the plant regenerating itself by putting up its solar panels, its leaves, it has to get going from the roots up. And that essentially causes soil organic matter to be depleted, which is essentially releasing carbon into the atmosphere. Whereas if we graze in the right way, such as on the other couple of pictures, it absorbs CO2, and we've already talked about how much it can absorb. But all this is a big learning curve for many farmers to really optimise this, and we've got loads to learn ourselves too. We have been trialling mob grazing and holistic plant grazing with some good results, lots to learn, and we're trying to find really good resources out there that we're learning from, a couple of which I've shown here on the left. Just a quick mention to the guy in the top right is Rob Havard, who's probably one of the most well-respected mob grazers in certainly in the UK, if not the world, and learning a lot from Rob online in YouTube videos. What does all this mean for agriculture in the Home Valley? Well, bringing it back to Home Valley, the good news is it's almost all permanent grassland. So that already ticks a lot of the boxes about good farming practice. It's got living roots in the soil all year, sequestering carbon into soils. There's not much ploughing goes on or other physical disturbance, and there's livestock grazing the land in rotation. So it's a pretty good story overall. And of course, we can always improve. So we can plant more trees and hedges, and we have been doing, but there's really good grants available for that from Woodland Trust and Countryside Stewardship. And it also improves livestock shelter and gives a lot of, obviously, environmental benefits. And the things we're focusing on mainly ourselves, and what sort of you identify as kind of improvement points if you were being picky, is we need to build fertility naturally with animal rotation to reduce synthetic fertilizer use. Ideally, if we can remove it entirely, that'd be great. We need to encourage diversity in grasslands and not just stick to ryegrass. We need to try and bring other things into that, like clovers and a variety of different grassland plants. And we need to make sure that we're grazing in the right way. And everyone has a lot to learn with that, including us. And we're on that journey, and we're trying. But holistic plant grazing or mob grazing requires some thought, planning and management skills, but it's doable, and it has benefits to animals as well as the soil. And the last thing I'd like to say just quickly is that we've got some really great local farmers who are trying their best and really are taking care of the land around us really well. And lots of the media over the last few years has really demonised farming in a really broad brush way that's unfair to a lot of farmers who farm in the right way. And the same with red meat. In fact, you can say that the most sustainably produced meat from animals, certainly that have had the best and most natural life, is pasture-fed beef and lamb. And of course, we should be criticising unsustainable farming practices, and we all need to play our part in improving the natural world, particularly within the climate and environmental emergency that we're facing. But let's connect with our local farmers, let's support them, and let's find common ground, because they are feeling sometimes alienated. And these are good people who work hard, and nobody wants to live in a damaged natural world. And the farmers around us are really great stewards of our local landscape. There's loads of common ground there, and we need to reconnect with farmers. So I'd urge us all to do that and to have those conversations. Thanks very much for listening.
The aim of the group: to develop a land use plan for the Upper Home Valley that offers active ways of sequestering carbon, to develop a plan for improving the carbon footprint of farmers and other land users, to look at promoting local food producers and ways of selling locally to reduce our carbon footprint, to look at allotment provision and opportunities for growing locally to encourage local food production. How we started: through making connections, contacting local groups and charities, finding experts, and talking together. Developing a strategy: the idea of a joined-up map of land use and interested landowners, the interest of Huddersfield University, SURGE, which stands for Sustainable Responsibility, Governance and Ethics, in promoting local food and food security. Finding professional expertise in mapping of the Upper Home Valley to identify land ownership and use. Finding ecological experts to help the mapping. Looking at farming policy for funding future initiatives. Coddy's farm is the pilot for the study, and you'll see some of the activities that Coddy's farm has begun in order to make its farming practices environmentally friendly. The plan of action, all with the aim of lowering the carbon output of the Home Valley, improving the quality of tree cover, improving the quality of areas of wetland, moorland and pasture, increasing the production and sale of food locally, engaging the public in such activities, getting local charitable groups involved, designation of sites for tree planting, for example orchards, allotments, engaging the public in growing, encouraging the growing of food locally, increasing the production and sale of food grown and made locally, The two cows are grazing on the field, and you may be able to make out the faint lines on the ground. This is where 1,200 metres of pipes are buried at a depth of 1.2 metres to extract energy from the ground to heat the building through our ground source heat pump. Every 1 kilowatt of electric powering the heat pump generates 2.5 kilowatts of heat. Much of the electric is from our 2 Gaia wind turbines. This field at Coddy's farm has been rewilding for several years. During the spring and summer months we have brightly coloured foxgloves as well as many other common and some not so common wildflowers. Nettles grow for much of the year, and although we need to keep them under control so they don't smother the rest of the flowers, they're a great habitat for over 40 different insects. We have 2 Gaia wind turbines at Coddy's farm, one installed in 2012, the second in 2014. Between them they have generated over 5.5 million kilowatt hours, averaging 80,000 kilowatt hours per year. Coddy's farm uses approximately half this, with the remainder diverted to hot water or into the national grid. We are currently looking how we can utilise even more of this energy.